The door slammed behind her with such force that the entire porch shook, and Julia Thompson stumbled forward in nothing but her worn cotton dress, her feet bare against the rough wooden planks that lined the front of the only home she had known for the past 3 years in Pahrump, Nevada. You are nothing but a burden and a reminder of your mother's weakness. Her stepfather's voice boomed from inside the small ranch house, followed by the sound of the bolt sliding into place. Do not come back here. Ever! Julia's hands trembled as she turned to face the locked door, her breath coming in short gasps as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her like a rock slide. The afternoon sun of August 1882 beat down mercilessly on her shoulders, and she knew that once night fell, the desert temperature would plummet. She had no money, no shoes, no shawl, nothing but the thin dress that clung to her frame and the memories of her mother, who had died just 6 months earlier from fever. She stood frozen for several moments, her mind racing through the events that had led to this moment. Her stepfather, Marcus Brennan, had grown increasingly hostile since her mother's passing. He had married her mother 5 years ago, when Julia was only 13, and while he had never been warm, he had at least been civil when her mother was alive. But now, with no one to restrain his cruelty, he had finally made good on his threats to cast her out. The final confrontation had come that morning when Julia had refused his attempt to arrange a marriage for her to a cattle buyer nearly 40 years her senior, a man whose reputation for violence toward women was well known throughout the Nevada territory. Julia forced her feet to move, stepping off the porch and onto the dusty ground. The small ranch sat about 3 miles outside of Pahrump proper, and she knew she had to reach town before darkness fell. The desert was unforgiving, filled with rattlesnakes, scorpions, and other dangers that emerged with the cooling temperatures. She wrapped her arms around herself and began walking, each step sending small clouds of dust rising around her bare feet. The road stretched before her like a ribbon of pale earth cutting through the sparse vegetation. Sagebrush dotted the landscape, and in the distance the mountains rose like silent sentinels guarding the valley. Julia's throat was already dry, and she knew she had made a terrible mistake by not at least trying to grab a canteen before her stepfather had physically pushed her out the door. But there was no going back now. She could only move forward. She had walked perhaps half a mile when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Her heart seized with fear that her stepfather had changed his mind and was coming after her, perhaps to do worse than simply cast her out. She turned, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw a lone rider approaching at a steady pace. The horse was a magnificent chestnut mare, and the man in the saddle sat with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his entire life on horseback. As he drew closer, Julia could make out more details. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, a dark shirt with a leather vest, worn denim pants, and boots that had clearly seen many miles of hard travel. A bandana hung loosely around his neck, and she could see the glint of spurs on his heels. The rider slowed as he approached, and Julia instinctively took a step back, her arms tightening around herself. She had learned to be wary of strangers, especially men, in this harsh land where the law was often little more than a suggestion, and justice came from the barrel of a gun. "Miss?" the rider called out, his voice carrying a note of concern. He brought his horse to a stop about 10 feet away, and Julia finally got a clear look at his face. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with strong features bronzed by the sun. His eyes were a striking shade of blue-green, like the desert sky just after dawn, and they regarded her with genuine worry. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Julia replied automatically, though her voice cracked from thirst, and her entire body trembled. The rider dismounted in one smooth motion, and Julia noticed he was tall, probably well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. He approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. "Forgive me for saying so, miss, but you do not look fine," he said gently. "You are out here in the heat with no shoes, no hat, and unless I miss my guess, no water." He reached for the canteen, hanging from his saddle horn, and held it out to her. Please drink. Julia hesitated for only a moment before her desperate thirst won out over her caution. She took the canteen with shaking hands and drank deeply, the lukewarm water tasting better than anything she could remember. She forced herself to stop before she drank it all, handing it back to him with a whispered, "Thank you." "Vincent Holloway," he said, introducing himself with a slight nod. "I work at the Silver Ridge Ranch about 5 miles north of town." He studied her for a moment, his expression growing more concerned. "What happened to you?" The kindness in his voice nearly broke through the wall Julia had built around her emotions, but she managed to keep her composure. "I am walking to town. I will be fine once I get there." "That's still a good 2.5 miles," Vincent said, "and the sun is not going to get any gentler." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Look, I do not mean to pry, but something is clearly wrong. Did someone hurt you? Are you running from something?" Julia felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "My stepfather put me out. I have nowhere else to go except town, where I hope to find work." Vincent's jaw tightened, and something flashed in his eyes that might have been anger, though it did not seem directed at her. "He put you out like this, with nothing?" "He said I was a burden," Julia replied, surprised by her own honesty. Perhaps it was the heat, or the shock of her situation, or simply the genuine concern in this stranger's eyes that made her speak so freely. Vincent was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the horizon before returning to her face. Then, without a word, he shrugged out of the long duster coat he wore despite the heat and stepped forward, draping it carefully around her shoulders. The coat was still warm from his body, and it smelled of leather, horse, and something else. Something clean and masculine that Julia could not quite identify. It was far too large for her, the hem nearly reaching her ankles, but it provided a barrier against the sun and a strange sense of safety. "I cannot take your coat," Julia protested, even as her fingers instinctively clutched the edges. "You will need it when the temperature drops tonight." "I have another back at the ranch," Vincent said, which Julia suspected was a lie. "And I am not the one walking to town in nothing but a dress." He moved back to his horse and gathered the reins. "Please, let me give you a ride into Pahrump. It is not safe for you to be walking out here alone." Julia wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity and independence, but she knew he was right. The desert was dangerous, and she was in no condition to make the journey on foot. "I would be grateful," she finally said. Vincent's face brightened with relief, and he led his horse closer. "Her name is Copper," he said, patting the mare's neck affectionately. "She is gentle as a lamb." He mounted first, then extended his hand down to Julia. "Put your foot on mine, and I will pull you up." Julia had ridden horses before, back when her mother was alive, and they had lived on a small farm in California, but she had never ridden double. She placed her foot on Vincent's boot and grasped his hand, startled by the strength with which he lifted her, as if she weighed nothing at all. She settled behind him on the saddle, acutely aware of how improper this was, but having no other choice. "Hold on," Vincent said, and Julia hesitantly placed her hands on his waist. She could feel the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the warmth of him through the fabric. He urged Copper forward at a walk, keeping the pace easy and steady. They rode in silence for several minutes, and Julia found herself gradually relaxing, despite the strangeness of the situation. Vincent was a skilled rider, his movements in perfect harmony with his horse, and he seemed in no hurry to pry into her affairs or make uncomfortable conversation. "What kind of work are you looking for in town?" Vincent finally asked, his voice carrying easily over the sound of Copper's hoofbeats. "Anything honest," Julia replied. "I can cook, clean, sew, and I am good with numbers. My mother taught me to read and write, and I can do basic bookkeeping." "That is more education than most have out here," Vincent observed, The boarding house in town might be looking for help. Mrs. Patterson runs it, and she is a fair woman, if a bit stern. I will try there first then, Julia said, grateful for the suggestion. I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Holloway. Not many men would stop to help a stranger. Call me Vincent, he said, and I was raised to believe that we should help each other when we can. Life out here is hard enough without turning our backs on those in need. He paused. If you do not mind my asking, what is your name? Julia Thompson, she replied. Well, Miss Thompson, I am glad I came along when I did. There was something warm in his voice that made Julia's chest feel tight. Are you originally from Nevada? California, Julia said. My mother and I came here after she married my stepfather. She met him when he was passing through Sacramento on business. She fell silent, not wanting to speak more about the man who had just thrown her out. Vincent seemed to sense her reluctance to discuss it further. California is beautiful country. I passed through there a few years back when I was working on a cattle drive. The green valleys and the ocean, it is like a different world from here. I miss it sometimes, Julia admitted. But my mother wanted to be with her husband, and I wanted to be with her. She felt the familiar ache of grief that came with thoughts of her mother. She died 6 months ago from fever. The doctor in town tried everything, but nothing helped. I am sorry, Vincent said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Losing a mother is a terrible thing. I lost mine when I was 15, to cholera. My father followed her 2 years later, thrown from a horse. So you are alone too, Julia said softly. I suppose I am, though I have good friends at the ranch where I work. They are like family in their own way. He adjusted his hold on the reins as Copper navigated around a large rock in the path. The foreman, Jack Sullivan, gave me a chance when I was just a green kid who barely knew which end of a cow to milk. I have been at Silver Ridge for 8 years now, and it is the closest thing to a home I have had since my parents died. Julia found herself wanting to know more about this man who had stopped to help her, who had given her his coat without a second thought. What do you do at the ranch? A bit of everything, Vincent replied. Mostly I work with the horses. We breed and train them for sale to the cavalry and to other ranches. I have always had a way with horses, ever since I was a boy. They make more sense to me than people do most of the time. Despite everything, Julia smiled slightly at that. I think I understand what you mean. They crested a small rise, and the town of Pahrump came into view below them. It was not a large town, perhaps 200 souls at most, but it had grown in recent years with the mining boom in the surrounding mountains. The main street was lined with wooden buildings, some painted and well-maintained, others weathered to gray. Julia could make out the general store, the saloon, the church with its white steeple, and various other establishments. The boarding house is on the east end of town, Vincent said, guiding Copper down the slope. The yellow building with the green shutters. You cannot miss it. As they entered the town proper, Julia became acutely aware of the attention they were drawing. Several people stopped what they were doing to watch them pass, and she could see the curiosity and speculation in their eyes. A young woman riding double with a man, wearing only a dress and a coat far too large for her, was bound to cause talk. Vincent seemed unbothered by the attention, keeping Copper at a steady walk until they reached the boarding house. It was a 2-story building that looked well kept, with a neat garden in front and lace curtains in the windows. He brought Copper to a stop near the front porch and dismounted, then reached up to help Julia down. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her, setting her gently on the ground. For a moment they stood close together, and Julia found herself looking up into his face, struck again by the kindness she saw there. He was handsome, she realized, in a rugged, unpolished way that suited this harsh land. Thank you, Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. I do not know what I would have done if you had not come along. You would have survived, Vincent said with quiet confidence. You have that look about you, like you are stronger than you think you are. He glanced at the boarding house. Would you like me to come in with you? Help explain the situation to Mrs. Patterson? Julia shook her head. You have already done so much. I should face this on my own. Vincent looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. All right, but I want you to keep the coat. You will need it. I cannot keep your coat, Julia protested. How will I return it to you? I will be in town again in a few days, Vincent said. I can collect it then if you insist on returning it. But truly, I want you to have it. Consider it a gift from one lost soul to another. Julia felt tears welling up again, and this time she could not stop one from escaping down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. You are a good man, Vincent Holloway. Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite read. I will check back in a few days to see how you are settling in. If Mrs. Patterson cannot take you on, come to Silver Ridge Ranch. We can always use extra help, especially someone with your skills. Before Julia could respond, the front door of the boarding house opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was in her 50s, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She wore a practical dark dress with a white apron, and her expression was one of stern curiosity. Vincent Holloway, what trouble have you brought to my doorstep? The woman asked, though there was no real heat in her tone. No trouble at all, Mrs. Patterson, Vincent replied with a respectful nod. This is Miss Julia Thompson. She is in need of work and lodging, and I thought you might be able to help her. Mrs. Patterson's sharp gaze swept over Julia, taking in her bare feet, the oversized coat, and her disheveled appearance. Whatever she saw must have satisfied some internal judgment because her expression softened slightly. Come inside, girl. Vincent, you can be on your way. I will take care of this. Vincent met Julia's eyes one more time, and she saw reassurance there, along with something else she could not quite name. Good luck, Miss Thompson. I will see you again soon. Goodbye, Vincent, Julia said, clutching his coat around her. And thank you truly. She watched as he mounted Copper and rode away, disappearing around the corner of the main street. Only when he was out of sight did she turn to face Mrs. Patterson, squaring her shoulders and preparing to make her case for employment. Mrs. Patterson stepped aside and gestured for Julia to enter. Well, do not just stand there, girl. Come in and tell me what has happened to put you in such a state. The interior of the boarding house was clean and comfortable, with simple but well-maintained furniture. The front room served as a parlor, with several chairs arranged around a fireplace and a dining table visible through a doorway to what must be the dining room. The smell of bread baking wafted from somewhere deeper in the house, making Julia's empty stomach clench with hunger. Mrs. Patterson led her to the kitchen, a large room dominated by a wood-burning stove and a long work table. Sit, she commanded, pointing to a chair. You look like you are about to collapse. Julia sat gratefully, and Mrs. Patterson busied herself pouring a glass of water and cutting a thick slice of bread, which she placed in front of Julia along with a pat of butter. Eat slowly. Your stomach will revolt if you eat too fast after going without. Julia obeyed, forcing herself to take small bites, even though she wanted to devour the bread in seconds. Mrs. Patterson sat across from her, hands folded on the table, and waited patiently until Julia had finished eating and drinking. Now, Mrs. Patterson said, tell me what happened, and do not leave anything out. I cannot help you if I do not know the full situation. Something about the woman's no-nonsense demeanor made Julia feel safe enough to speak honestly. She told her everything about her mother's death, about her stepfather's increasing cruelty, about his attempt to force her into marriage with a violent man, and about being thrown out with nothing but her dress. The only thing she did not mention in great detail was her encounter with Vincent, though she did explain that he had given her the coat and brought her to town. When she finished, Mrs. Patterson was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the street. Your stepfather is Marcus Brennan, is he not? The man who owns the small cattle ranch outside of town? Yes, Julia confirmed. I know of him, Mrs. Patterson said, her tone disapproving. He is not well liked in Pahrump. There have been rumors about his temper and his treatment of his workers. No one was surprised when his ranch hands quit and he could not find replacements. She turned back to face Julia. You are better off away from him, though I wish it had not come to this. Do you have work for me? Julia asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. I will do anything. I am a hard worker and I learn quickly. Mrs. Patterson studied her for another moment, then nodded decisively. I could use help, especially with the evening meal and the cleaning. I have 6 boarders currently, and I am not as young as I used to be. The work is hard and the hours are long, but I provide room and board plus a small wage. You would have a room in the attic. Nothing fancy, but it is clean and private. Relief flooded through Julia so powerfully that she felt dizzy. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I will work as hard as I can. You will not regret giving me this chance. See that I do not, Mrs. Patterson said, but her tone was not unkind. You can start tomorrow morning. For now, let me show you to your room. You need rest, and we need to find you some proper clothes and shoes. She led Julia up 2 flights of narrow stairs to the attic, which had been converted into a small but cozy room. There was a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a window that looked out over the main street of Pahrump. It was simple, but it was clean and safe, and Julia felt tears of gratitude welling up. I have some dresses that might fit you with a bit of alteration, Mrs. Patterson said, sizing Julia up with a practiced eye. And I will find you some shoes. We can take the cost out of your wages over time. She paused at the door. Get some rest, Miss Thompson. Tomorrow your new life begins. After Mrs. Patterson left, Julia carefully removed Vincent's coat and laid it across the foot of the bed. She ran her hand over the worn leather, remembering the kindness in his eyes and the gentleness of his manner. She wondered if she would truly see him again, or if his promise had been merely politeness. The thought of not seeing him again left her with an unexpected sense of loss. She lay down on the bed, too exhausted to even remove her dress, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next 3 days passed in a blur of hard work. Julia rose before dawn to help Mrs. Patterson prepare breakfast for the boarders, then spent the day cleaning rooms, doing laundry, mending linens, and helping prepare the evening meal. The work was exhausting, but Julia threw herself into it with determination. She was grateful for the distraction, as it kept her mind from dwelling on her mother's death and her stepfather's cruelty. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a fair employer, stern but never cruel. She showed Julia how she liked things done and expected those standards to be maintained, but she also made sure Julia ate properly and got enough rest. The other boarders were a varied lot: a banker, 2 miners, a traveling salesman, a school teacher, and a widow who lived there permanently. They treated Julia with varying degrees of courtesy, but none were unkind. On the 4th day since her arrival, Julia was hanging laundry in the backyard when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Her heart leaped, and she turned to see Vincent riding up on Copper, a smile breaking across his weathered face when he spotted her. Miss Thompson, he called out, dismounting and walking toward her. I am glad to see you looking so well. Julia set down the wet sheet she had been hanging and returned his smile, acutely aware of how her heart was racing. She had thought about him more than she cared to admit over the past few days, wondering if he would truly return as promised. Vincent, it is good to see you. I was not sure if you would come back. I said I would, did I not? He looked genuinely puzzled by her doubt. I wanted to make sure you were settling in all right. Mrs. Patterson treating you fairly? She is very fair, Julia assured him. The work is hard, but I am grateful for it. She has given me a place to stay and purpose. She gestured to the house. Would you like to come inside? I can offer you some lemonade or coffee. Lemonade sounds fine, Vincent said, following her into the kitchen through the back door. Julia was grateful that Mrs. Patterson was out doing shopping and the boarders were all away at their various employments. She poured 2 glasses of lemonade from the pitcher in the icebox and sat with Vincent at the kitchen table, very conscious of how domestic and comfortable it felt. "You are wearing shoes," Vincent observed with a smile. Julia glanced down at the simple brown leather shoes on her feet. "Mrs. Patterson found them for me, along with some dresses. She has been very kind." She paused. "I still have your coat upstairs. Let me go get it for you." "Wait," Vincent said, reaching out as if to stop her but not quite touching her. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk for a bit first." Something in his tone made Julia's pulse quicken. "Of course. What would you like to talk about?" Vincent seemed uncharacteristically nervous, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "I have been thinking about you a lot these past few days. I know we have only just met, but there is something about you, Miss Thompson, something that I cannot quite get out of my mind." Julia felt her cheeks warming. "I have thought about you too," she admitted softly. "You saved me that day, Vincent. I will never forget your kindness." "It was not just kindness," Vincent said, his blue-green eyes intense as they met hers. "At least, it started as kindness, but the moment I saw you standing there on that road, so brave and defiant despite everything that had happened to you, something shifted in my chest. And when I lifted you onto copper and you held on to me as we rode, I felt something I have not felt in a very long time." "What did you feel?" Julia whispered, though she thought she knew. She felt it too, this inexplicable connection to a man she barely knew. "Hope," Vincent said simply. "I have been alone for so long, Miss Thompson. Julia, if I may call you that. I have been drifting from one day to the next, working hard but never really building toward anything. But meeting you made me realize that I want more. I want a future, a home, a family. I want something to work for besides just surviving." Julia's breath caught in her throat. This was happening so fast, too fast by any reasonable measure, and yet it felt right in a way she could not explain. "I feel the same way," she said. "I know it seems impossible. We have only just met, but when I am with you, I feel safe. I feel like maybe everything will be all right." Vincent reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I would like to court you properly, Julia Thompson. I want to take the time to know you, to let you know me, and to see if this connection between us is real or just the result of extraordinary circumstances." "I would like that very much," Julia said, her heart soaring. "But we should be careful. People will talk if we move too quickly." "Let them talk," Vincent said with a grin. "I am 25 years old, and I have spent enough of my life worrying about what others think, but I will respect your wishes. We will take this slowly and do things properly." Over the following weeks, Vincent became a regular visitor to the boarding house. He came by every few days, always finding some excuse. He needed to pick up supplies in town, or he had to deliver a message to one of Mrs. Patterson's boarders, or he simply wanted to check on Julia. Mrs. Patterson observed this courtship with a knowing eye, but said nothing, though Julia caught her smiling more than once when she thought no one was looking. Vincent and Julia would sit in the parlor under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye, talking for hours about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Julia learned that Vincent had been born in Texas but had traveled extensively throughout the West, working various jobs before settling in Nevada. He loved horses with a passion that bordered on reverence, and he spoke of his dream to one day have his own ranch where he could breed and train horses without having to answer to anyone else. Julia, in turn, shared her memories of California and her mother, the pain of losing her and the fear of finding herself alone in the world. She talked about her love of reading and numbers, how her mother had insisted on educating her despite the expense and the skepticism of others who thought education wasted on a girl. Vincent listened intently to every word, asking thoughtful questions and never making her feel foolish for her feelings or her dreams. On Sundays, when Julia had a few hours of freedom after the morning chores were done, Vincent would take her riding. He borrowed a gentle mare from the ranch, and they would ride out into the desert together, always staying within sight of town to preserve Julia's reputation. These rides became the highlight of Julia's week. There was something magical about the vast open spaces, the way the sunlight played across the mountains, and the comfortable silence that could exist between her and Vincent. One Sunday in early October, as the brutal heat of summer was finally beginning to ease, Vincent took Julia to a place he called Hidden Springs. It was a small oasis about an hour's ride from town where water bubbled up from underground and created a pool surrounded by cottonwood trees. The grass was green and lush, a stark contrast to the brown desert surrounding it. They dismounted and let the horses drink while they sat in the shade of the trees. Julia had packed a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples, which they shared while watching a hawk circle overhead. "This place is beautiful," Julia said, leaning back against a tree trunk. "How did you find it?" "Stumbled across it a few years ago when I was tracking a lost horse," Vincent said. "I come here sometimes when I need to think or when the world gets to be too much." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I have never brought anyone else here. This is my private place, but I wanted to share it with you." Julia felt the weight of that confession. "I am honored that you would share it with me." Vincent shifted closer, and Julia's heart began to race. They had not yet kissed, though there had been moments when she thought he might, moments when the air between them seemed charged with possibility. This felt like one of those moments. "Julia," Vincent said softly, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. "I know we have not known each other long, but I am certain about my feelings. I am falling in love with you." "I am falling in love with you too," Julia whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. Vincent leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Julia did not want to pull away. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a tentative exploration that made her feel cherished and desired in equal measure. The kiss deepened gradually, and Julia found herself leaning into him, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, where she could feel his heart hammering beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I want to marry you, Julia. I know it is too soon to ask, but I needed you to know my intentions. I am courting you with marriage in mind." "I want that too," Julia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I want to be your wife." "Then we will do this right," Vincent said, pulling back slightly so he could look into her eyes. "I will court you for as long as is proper, and when the time is right, I will ask you to marry me in a way you deserve. I will speak to Mrs. Patterson first, since you have no family to give their blessing." Julia felt tears slipping down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. After so much loss and pain, she had found someone who saw her, who valued her, who wanted to build a life with her. It seemed almost too good to be true. The courtship continued through October and into November. Vincent was patient and respectful, always the perfect gentleman, though Julia could sense the depth of his feelings in every look, every touch, every word. Mrs. Patterson gave her approval of the match, telling Julia privately that Vincent Holloway was one of the finest young men in the territory and that she would be lucky to have him. On Thanksgiving Day, the boarding house was closed to outsiders, but Mrs. Patterson had invited Vincent to join them for dinner. It was a festive occasion, with roast turkey and all the trimmings, and Julia had spent days helping to prepare. As they sat around the table, Julia looked at the faces surrounding her, the boarders who had become familiar friends, Mrs. Patterson, who had become a surrogate mother figure, and Vincent, the man she loved with all her heart. This, she realized, was family. Not the family she had been born into, but the family she had chosen and who had chosen her. After dinner, as the autumn sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Vincent asked Julia to step outside with him. They stood on the porch, and Vincent took both of her hands in his. "Julia Thompson," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I have been waiting for the right moment to do this, and I cannot think of a better day than this one, when we are meant to give thanks for our blessings. You are my greatest blessing, the answer to prayers I did not even know I was praying." He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple gold ring. It was not fancy, but it gleamed in the fading light, and Julia thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Will you marry me?" Vincent asked. "Will you be my wife and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy?" "Yes," Julia breathed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes, Vincent, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and Julia wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with all the love and hope and joy she felt. When they finally broke apart and turned to go back inside, they found Mrs. Patterson and all the boarders crowded at the window, watching and grinning. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, her stern face transformed by a genuine smile. "Well, it is about time," she said. "I was beginning to think the boy would never get around to asking." There was laughter and congratulations all around, and someone produced a bottle of wine that had been saved for a special occasion. They toasted the engaged couple, and Julia felt herself glowing with happiness. The wedding was planned for late December, giving them time to make arrangements, but not drawing out the engagement too long. Vincent wanted to marry her as soon as possible, and Julia felt the same way. Mrs. Patterson threw herself into helping Julia prepare, taking her to the dressmaker in town to have a wedding dress made from white cotton with lace trim. It was simple but lovely, and when Julia tried it on for the first time, she could hardly believe that she was really going to be married. Vincent, meanwhile, was busy preparing for their future. He had saved money over his years of working at Silver Ridge Ranch, and he used it to purchase a small piece of land about 2 miles from the ranch. It was not much, just 20 acres with a creek running through it, but it was theirs. He spent every spare moment building a house, a modest 2-room cabin that would be their first home together. His fellow ranch hands helped when they could, and the foreman, Jack Sullivan, donated lumber and supplies as a wedding gift. Julia visited the property several times as the house took shape, and each visit filled her with excitement. This would be their home, the place where they would start their life together, where they would raise their family. Vincent had already started planning where they would build the stable for the horses he planned to breed, where Julia's garden would go, where they could expand the house as their family grew. On December 20th, 1882, under a clear winter sky, Julia Thompson married Vincent Holloway in the small white church in Pahrump. It was not a large wedding, but it was filled with love. Mrs. Patterson stood as Julia's witness, tears streaming down her face that she made no effort to hide. Jack Sullivan stood up with Vincent, clapping him on the back and joking about how marriage would be the taming of him, the boarders from Mrs. Patterson's house attended, along with several of the ranch hands from Silver Ridge and various townspeople who had come to know and like the young couple. Julia walked down the aisle in her white dress with her head held high, her eyes locked on Vincent's face. He stood at the altar looking handsome in a new suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes bright with emotion. When she reached him and took his hand, she felt the rightness of it settle over her like a benediction. The ceremony was simple and traditional. They exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Vincent kissed her with a tenderness that made Julia's knees weak. The reception was held at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, which had been decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. There was food and music and dancing, and Julia danced with her new husband until her feet ached. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Vincent whispered in her ear that it was time for them to leave as well. They rode together on Copper to their new home, the little cabin that Vincent had built with his own hands. He had prepared it for their arrival, with a fire burning in the fireplace, candles lit throughout the room, and wildflowers that he had somehow found in winter arranged in a jar on the table. Vincent lifted Julia over the threshold, and she laughed with pure joy as he carried her inside. He set her down gently, and they stood together in the center of their home, looking at each other with wonder and desire and love. "Welcome home, Mrs. Holloway," Vincent said softly. "Mrs. Holloway," Julia repeated, savoring the sound of it. "I like that very much." That night, as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Julia marveled at how her life had transformed. Months ago, she had been cast out with nothing, facing an uncertain and frightening future. Now she was here, in the arms of a man who loved her deeply, building a life that was wholly their own. The first years of their marriage were marked by hard work and deep contentment. Vincent continued working at Silver Ridge Ranch while also building up their own property. Julia kept house, tended her garden, and worked part-time at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house a few days a week. The extra income helped them save money for the stock and equipment they would need to start their own horse breeding operation. In the summer of 1883, Julia discovered she was pregnant. Vincent was overjoyed at the news, treating Julia as if she were made of glass, despite her insistence that she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. He built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth and carving little horses into the headboard. Julia sewed baby clothes and blankets, her heart full of anticipation for the child they would soon meet. On a cold February night in 1884, after many hours of labor with Mrs. Patterson serving as midwife, Julia gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel Vincent Holloway, and Vincent wept openly as he held his son for the first time, cradling the tiny bundle against his chest and whispering promises about the life they would give him. Samuel was a happy baby with his father's blue-green eyes and his mother's dark hair. Vincent proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to help when the baby cried, rocking him to sleep while singing old cowboy songs, carrying him everywhere in a sling Julia had fashioned. Watching her husband with their son, Julia fell even more deeply in love with him. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the Holloway property grew as well. Vincent had finally saved enough to purchase their first breeding horses, a magnificent stallion and 3 mares with excellent bloodlines. He quit his job at Silver Ridge Ranch with Jack Sullivan's blessing and good wishes, dedicating himself fully to building their ranch. The work was hard and the financial margin was thin, but they were building something together, something that would last. In 1886, Julia became pregnant again, this time giving birth to a daughter they named Rose Margaret. She was a tiny, delicate baby who nonetheless had a fierce will and a loud cry that could be heard throughout the ranch. Samuel, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and often trying to share his toys with her even when she was too young to appreciate them. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations, challenges and triumphs. The horse breeding operation prospered, with Vincent developing a reputation throughout Nevada for producing strong, intelligent, well-trained horses. Julia managed the business side of the operation, keeping the books and handling correspondence with buyers. They expanded their land holdings, built a larger house with 4 bedrooms, and constructed the stable complex that Vincent had always dreamed of. In 1888, their 3rd child was born, another boy they named Thomas. In 1891, they welcomed their 4th and final child, a daughter named Emma. Their house was full of noise and laughter, of childish quarrels and tender moments, of the countless small details that make up a family's life. Through it all, Vincent and Julia's love for each other only deepened. They still found time to ride out to Hidden Springs on occasion, leaving the children with Mrs. Patterson for an afternoon so they could reconnect with each other and remember the early days of their courtship. They worked side by side every day, partners in every sense of the word, and they never let a day pass without telling each other how much they were loved. Julia sometimes thought back to that terrible day when her stepfather had thrown her out, when she had stood on that dusty road with nothing but her dress and fear for the future. She thought about how Vincent had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer, how he had wrapped her in his coat and carried her to safety. That coat still hung in their closet, carefully preserved, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. On their 20th anniversary in December 1902, their children now grown, or nearly so, Vincent took Julia back to the spot where he had first found her on that road. They had ridden out on a mild winter day, retracing the path they had taken so many years before. "Do you remember?" Vincent asked, pulling Copper to a stop at the place where Julia had been walking all those years ago. "I remember everything," Julia said, smiling at him from atop the gentle mare she now rode. "I remember thinking my life was over, that I had nothing left, and then you came along and proved me wrong." Vincent dismounted and helped Julia down, pulling her into his arms. "You saved me just as much as I saved you," he said. "Before I met you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You gave me purpose and joy, and a reason to build something lasting." "We built it together," Julia said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. His hair was starting to show threads of silver now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "Together," Vincent agreed, and he kissed her with the same tenderness and passion he had shown her on their wedding day, and every day since. As they rode back to their ranch, Julia looked at the life they had built with deep satisfaction. Their children were thriving. Samuel, at 18, was already working the ranch alongside his father and showing a gift with horses that matched Vincent's own. Rose, at 16, was gentle and kind, helping her mother with the household and the younger children. Thomas, at 14, was wild and adventurous, always getting into mischief but with a good heart. And Emma, at 11, was smart and bookish, reminding Julia of herself at that age. The ranch was prosperous, their reputation solid, their future secure. They had weathered droughts and hard winters, economic downturns, and personal sorrows. They had lost friends to illness and old age, including Mrs. Patterson, who had passed peacefully in her sleep in 1898, leaving her boarding house to Julia in her will. They had sold the boarding house to a young couple just starting out, using the money to further expand their ranch. Through everything, they had faced it together, their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. In 1905, Samuel married a young woman named Catherine, who worked at the general store in town. Vincent and Julia hosted the wedding at the ranch, and Julia cried tears of joy watching her son pledge his life to another, just as she and Vincent had done so many years before. In 1906, Samuel and Catherine welcomed their first child, a son they named Vincent in honor of his grandfather, and Vincent Holloway wept as he held his first grandchild, the continuation of the family he and Julia had created. Rose married in 1908 to a school teacher from California who had come to Nevada looking for opportunity. They settled on a small farm adjacent to the Holloway Ranch, ensuring that Rose would remain close to her family. Thomas, true to his adventurous nature, joined the cavalry in 1909, breaking his mother's heart even as she proudly watched him ride away in his uniform. Emma showed no interest in marriage, instead attending teacher's college and eventually becoming the school teacher in Pahrump, educating a new generation of children. Vincent and Julia gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operation of the ranch as Samuel and his growing family took over more of the responsibilities. They were not idle in their semi-retirement. Vincent continued to work with the horses because he could not imagine a life without them, and Julia kept the books and managed the household. But they also had more time for each other, for long rides and quiet evenings on the porch, for visits with their children and grandchildren, for simply enjoying the life they had built. On a warm spring evening in 1915, as the sun was setting over the desert and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Vincent and Julia sat together on the porch of their home. They were both in their late 50s now, their hair more silver than dark, their hands marked by decades of hard work, but their love as strong as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Julia asked, resting her head on Vincent's shoulder. "Stopping on that road all those years ago? Taking a chance on a desperate girl with nothing to her name?" Vincent laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Not for a single moment. That was the best decision I ever made, Julia Holloway. You have given me everything: a home, a family, a purpose, a love that has sustained me through everything life has thrown our way." "You gave me those things too," Julia said softly. You saved my life that day, Vincent, not just by giving me your coat and bringing me to town, but by seeing something in me worth saving. You believed in me when I did not believe in myself. We saved each other, Vincent said, pulling her closer and pressing a kiss to the top of her head. And we built something beautiful together. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, horses nickering in the stable, the low of cattle, the creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. These were the sounds of home, of a life well lived, of dreams realized. Inside the house, they could hear Catherine moving about, preparing dinner for the family. Samuel would be in soon, from checking the horses one last time before bed. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Tomorrow, Rose and her husband would be coming for Sunday dinner, and Emma had promised to visit from town. This was their legacy, Julia thought. Not just the land and the horses and the prosperous ranch, but the family they had created, the love they had nurtured, the example they had set of what two people could build together when they committed themselves fully to each other and to their shared dreams. Vincent stood and extended his hand to Julia, pulling her to her feet. Come on, Mrs. Holloway. Let us go inside and see what our daughter-in-law is cooking up for dinner. Lead the way, Mr. Holloway, Julia said, taking his hand as she had done countless times over the past 33 years. They walked into their home together, hand in hand, surrounded by the family they had created and the love they had nurtured. Outside, the desert stretched away in every direction, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. But inside, there was warmth and light, and the knowledge that they had taken nothing and built everything. Julia Thompson, who had once stood on a dusty road with nothing but a dress and fear, had found her home. Vincent Holloway, who had once been drifting through life without purpose or direction, had found his anchor. Together, they had created something that would last long after they were gone, a family, a legacy, and a love story that would be told and retold for generations to come. As they joined their family around the dinner table that evening, saying grace and passing dishes and sharing stories of the day, Julia caught Vincent's eye across the table. He winked at her, that same mischievous twinkle she had first seen all those years ago, and she smiled back, her heart as full as it had ever been. This was happiness, she thought. This was what it meant to be truly blessed. And it had all started on a dusty road in the Nevada desert, when a cowboy had seen a girl in need and wrapped her in his coat, never imagining that in saving her, he would be saving himself as well. The years continued to roll by like the seasons, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own challenges and triumphs. They lost Thomas in 1918, killed in the Great War in a country far from home, and they mourned him together, leaning on each other through the darkest days of their lives. They celebrated as their grandchildren grew and had children of their own, filling the ranch with another generation of voices and laughter. Vincent and Julia grew old together, their steps slower, their bodies marked by age and hard work, but their love never diminishing. They spent their final years surrounded by the family they had created, secure in the knowledge that what they had built would continue long after they were gone. Vincent passed first, quietly in his sleep in the spring of 1925 at the age of 68. Julia held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke at the loss, she was grateful for every moment they had shared, for the beautiful life they had created together. She lived 3 more years, cared for lovingly by her children and grandchildren, before joining Vincent in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking their ranch. They were buried side by side under a shared headstone that read simply, Vincent and Julia Holloway, together forever. And in that small cemetery, under the vast Nevada sky they had both loved, their story came to its peaceful end. But the love they had shared lived on in their descendants, in the ranch they had built, in the countless small kindnesses and large sacrifices that had made their life together possible. Years later, their great-grandchildren would ask about the old leather coat that was preserved carefully in a glass case in the ranch house, and they would be told the story of how their great-grandfather had found their great-great-grandmother on a dusty road with nothing but her dress, and how he had wrapped her in his coat and changed both of their lives forever. They would be told about the love that had sustained two people through decades of life in a harsh and unforgiving land, about the family they had built from nothing, about the legacy of love and hard work and commitment that had been passed down through the generations. And in the telling of that story, Vincent and Julia Holloway lived on, their love immortal, their legacy secure, their story a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest romances begin with the simplest act of kindness, and that true love, once found, can build something that lasts forever.